November 28, 1994.
"500 peacekeepers held hostage."
It's very difficult for UNPROFOR to operate without the consent of the Serbs.
Allied warplanes declared impotent.
Entering the war with ground combat forces. This the United States is not prepared to do, this NATO is not prepared to do.
It's the end of the Atlantic Alliance and NATO as we've known it.
Is the word to describe the UN and NATO irrelevant?
This is ABC News Nightline. Substituting for Ted Koppel and reporting from Washington, Cokie Roberts.
For almost 3 years, we've been reporting on the seemingly endless war raging right in the heart of Europe. Tonight, there's a sense the end may be in sight. More than 200,000 civilians have been killed in Bosnia, more than 2 million displaced. But there are other major casualties. The Serbs have managed to drive a wedge between the United Nations, which is supposed to be keeping the peace, and the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, which keeps threatening retaliation against those who break the peace. The Serbs repeatedly defy both the UN and NATO. They take more and more Muslim territory. Now they occupy about 70% of Bosnia, and no one stops them. Now one of the few remaining Muslim towns, Bihac, is about to fall into Serbian hands, despite the fact the UN declared the town a safe haven and promised protection. ABC's Tony Bertley has been covering this war for years. He joins us from Sarajevo. Tony, what about it? Is the end now in sight? Is Bihac about to go to the Serbs, as Secretary Perry seemed to imply when he spoke about this earlier?
Well, it seems very much that Bihac could fall to the Serbs if they want it. We'll have to wait and see if they really do want it. They're around the town now, they have it under control, and it's at their mercy. We don't know at the moment if it's the end of something or the beginning of something. As we've seen now over Bihac, NATO and the United Nations does not have a sufficient deterrent to prevent the Serbs from doing what they want. And it's a very dangerous message indeed, because the message the Serbs are getting is that they are more powerful and stronger than the United Nations and NATO, and the policy in Bosnia is not working.
And is there any way to reverse that message, or do the Serbs just win?
At the moment, it seems very difficult to see how that will be reversed, considering the stand of the international community, unless people are prepared to give more to Bosnia in terms of strength, in terms of ground troops, in terms of hardware, military hardware on the ground. Then the Serbs will carry on and do what they want. They've rejected all peace proposals in the past, and now they realise they can achieve what they want, perhaps a greater Serbia, allied to Serbia, by using force, and there's nothing here on the ground or in the international arena that will stop them.
And is there any reason, very quickly, Tony, to believe that if there is a peace agreement that requires them giving up some of this territory that they've won, that they will do that?
Well, it depends what the territory is. They have a game plan in mind, and if you give them the territory they want and the certain areas they want, then perhaps they will give something back. But I don't think it will be anything like the plan the contact group has in mind, 51% to the Muslims and 49% to the Serbs. It doesn't seem workable at this moment.
So in your view, it looks like the Serbs have essentially won by being the aggressors.
There's certainly one at the moment. I don't know in the long term what will happen. That depends a lot on the international community and what the Bosnian government and the Bosnian army can do on the ground here.
Thank you very much, Tony Bertley in Sarajevo. Americans have always questioned what stake they have in Bosnia. Tonight, it's clear that this war has created a major split in an alliance that's been led by the United States. Here's ABC's Jim Laurie.
The battle for Bihac has exposed what had been there all along, deep divisions between Europe and America on Bosnia. In May 1993, the United Nations Security Council put into place an unworkable policy. 6 mainly Muslim regions of Bosnia, including Bihac, were declared safe areas to be protected from the Serbs by UN troops. The UN was given the sole authority to call in NATO air power, but there were never enough troops on the ground to protect anything. The undermanned, underarmed Europeans wearing the blue helmets of the UN were then faced with the choice of trying to save the safe areas or save themselves from Serb reprisals. All the while, Washington urged more aggressive action, more bombing against the Serbs, and a lifting of the arms embargo imposed on the Bosnians. These differences have now erupted into a bitter row, prompted in part by Senator Robert Dole on the eve of his departure on a trip to Europe.
Now I think we have a complete breakdown of NATO. We have UN vetoing targets driven by the British and the French, I must say, primarily the British. And my view is that I don't know what we do now.
To the British and the French, who maintained together more than 7,000 troops on the ground in Bosnia, those words were not only insulting, but showed a callous disregard for European lives.
You have an American administration which escalates the war rhetoric, talk about bombing and talk about being tough and helping the Muslim and all of that, and at the same time is not prepared to send a single soldier there.
It's European UN peacekeepers at risk, some now being held hostage by the Serbs. And while Senator Dole blames the Europeans, they blame the Americans.
The sense of disdain about the Americans in Europe now is almost palpable. For the first time for decades, it is actually fashionable in London to talk in dismissive terms about the Americans.
It's the end of the Atlantic Alliance and NATO as we've known it, because in the old days there used to be what we call the coupling between European security and American security. Now we have a war in Europe, and there is a clear divorce between the European interest and American interest.
Last week, their interests did come together long enough to agree on the launch of airstrikes by more than 50 NATO aircraft on a Serbian airfield supporting the assault on Bihac, an action that had little effect.
We have been described as having one arm tied behind our back. I would say that what you're seeing now is that both arms are free, but we're only allowed to deliver body blows.
Given the impotence of the UN, NATO, the Americans, and the Europeans in Bosnia, some agree there may now be only one solution left.
I think probably the only solution now is the one which some Americans and many Europeans are saying is probably inevitable, and that is to withdraw the troops.
Already, U.S. Navy ships carrying 2,000 Marines are heading toward Bosnia just in case they're wanted for an evacuation. But if UN troops are withdrawn, the Europeans warn there'll be grave consequences.
If the Europeans feel forced to withdraw, it would be a humiliation for the Europeans, no doubt. But it would also be one of the major cracks in the Transatlantic Alliance. We will spend the next few years blaming each other as to who is responsible for this.
If the UNPROFOR troops are pulled out, let no one have any doubts, not Senator Dole or anyone else, it will immediately increase the amount of atrocities, killing, starvation, many more women and children, many more Bosnians will die.
While few hold out much hope for Bosnia, there is hope the Atlantic Alliance can be saved. As one British politician put it, the truth is that governments on both sides of the Atlantic have made a mess of Bosnia. With a little humility, everyone would admit that. This is Jim Laurie for Nightline in London.
A little later in the broadcast, the administration's view. But first, when we come back, one of the president's toughest critics on Bosnia, Senator Bob Dole.
This is ABC News Nightline, brought to you by Ford.
Senator Bob Dole, who's about to become majority leader, has been scathing in his criticism of NATO, the UN, and President Clinton. Today, he flew to Brussels for the NATO meeting. We talked to him shortly after he arrived, and the senator minced no words.
I'm a strong supporter of NATO, but I must say we have all these countries voting for all these resolutions, United Nations, to get tough with Serbia, get tough with the aggressor, and that's passed on to NATO, and then NATO is prepared to strike, and somebody on the ground never calls for airstrikes or never defines the target or never gives them a variety of targets. And it's a very, very difficult task for NATO. But as I said recently, as past 24 hours, it's almost reached the point where NATO may be irrelevant. If they can't do what they're prepared to do, then what is their real purpose? I think that's a question I hope to address.
You've said that President Clinton should be taking the lead and provide some leadership in this part of the world. Can he do that without injecting hundreds of thousands of U.S. troops?
Well, it seems to me it's about time for the president and the leaders of these countries to sit down, and I know the president met today with his advisors. I know he's concerned about Bosnia. I know he's concerned about the slaughter there. But we've had a policy that for the past, well, from the outset in the Bush administration, continuing in the Clinton administration, has just gone nowhere. And there's no peace to keep. Even the peacekeepers are in jeopardy. I noticed today the British defense minister, in effect, attacked me. Certainly, I have no quarrel with the bravery of the British forces, but what's their purpose there? What purpose are the UN protection forces now? And maybe it's time we try another option, that's pulling out of Bosnia, lifting the arms embargo, and give the Bosnians a chance to defend themselves.
Well, of course, Secretary Perry would say that would widen the war, and he argues that we have succeeded in stopping the spread of the war and in holding down the degree of violence. Do you think that's true?
Oh, I think that's totally inaccurate. In fact, he said yesterday the war was over. I think that's a mistake. That can't be very heartening, probably very heartening to the Serbs. It doesn't do much for the people on the defensive. Lift the arms embargo. That was what candidate Clinton said in 1992. We ought to lift the arms embargo. We ought to have airstrikes. I supported the president after his election. We met at the White House. We talked about it with the vice president and others. And suddenly it just disappeared. All those options disappeared.
Well, it's my impression that one of the reasons those options disappeared is that the military leaders were saying that airstrikes wouldn't do it, and that it would eventually involve U.S. ground forces, and that there was just no will to do that. Do you have a will to do that?
There's never been any question about putting troops on the ground. The answer has been no from the start, from the president, from the Congress. The president did talk about 25,000 Americans as a peacekeeping force, but I suggest that right now we have the United Nations protection forces in danger. They're not protecting the civilians. The Bihac has about 70,000 civilians. It's about to be taken. A third of it's already been taken. It'll be taken by the Serbs whenever they decide to take it. And what purpose is being served now? It seems to me the policy is flawed, and there ought to be a dramatic change, or there ought to be a pullout.
German Chancellor Kohl says that this is a disgrace for civilized Europe. Do you see this whole policy as a disgrace?
It's going to be a sad chapter when history is written about the way the West reacted or failed to react. And I would say, too, been asked, well, you know, if we lift the arms embargo, are we going to sell arms to the Bosnians? I said, well, maybe that's true, but there are probably 90 other nations out there willing to help the Bosnians, too. This is not just a question that the United States, the British, the French, and the other countries may be directly involved now.
Senator, you say it's a sad chapter, but of course the argument you always get back is that there's so many trouble spots around the world, and what are we supposed to do? Go into all of them and fix them all?
But I think we do have an indirect interest here. If this spreads, and we never know quite what the Serbs have in mind, to Kosovo, to Albania, then we're getting into areas where we have our NATO allies involved, Greece, Turkey, and others who have different views on what should happen. Then I think, with no question about it, we'd have an interest then. I think it's gone on so long now, it's gone on to the point where I'm not certain, what I would recommend. But it seemed to me one thing you could recommend is to pull out the United Nations Protection Force so nobody's in harm's way. We could even help evacuate these if necessary, as Secretary Perry suggested yesterday, and then have some powerful airstrikes. Robust airstrikes. The Secretary talked about strikes that would really have an impact on the Serb aggressors.
But you don't see that happening?
Yeah, well, it could happen. There's certainly no policy now. The lack of policy, lack of resolve. I think NATO's prepared, but again, they can be vetoed initially by, well, they can be vetoed on the ground. They can be vetoed initially by saying, let's don't take any action. So it's a willing force, NATO, with an unwilling partner, the United Nations, and nothing happens.
And is the United States also an unwilling partner?
I think to the extent the President has not demonstrated and exercised strong leadership at the top, I'm talking about strong leaders at the top, going to other world leaders. When they had the summit here earlier this year, Bosnia was sort of wasn't pushed off the agenda. They tried to push it off the agenda, in effect, but you couldn't push it off the agenda. This is not going to go away. But the bottom line is, it's getting worse. 200,000 casualties. How many more do you have to destroy? How many more children? How many more towns do you burn? And to say that we're going to provide humanitarian aid to people who are dying, to me, is not an answer.
Okay, thank you very much, Senator Dole. We appreciate you joining us from Brussels. When we come back, the administration's view from the State Department. Peter Tarnoff is Undersecretary of State for Political Affairs. He joins us from our Washington studio. Secretary Tarnoff, what about it? Is this war about to be over?
I don't think so, Cokie. I think, unfortunately for the people of Bosnia, it's going to go on for some time. But I think it's very important for us to keep in mind that there is a diplomatic track, one that involves a majority of the international community, the major powers. There are tactical differences among us, and there are differences between countries which have forces on the ground and those like the United States which don't. But I don't see a resolution coming all that soon, certainly not a Serbian victory.
A diplomatic track, which as I understand it, includes allowing the Serbs in Bosnia to hook up with the Serbs in Serbia and eventually get to a greater Serbia. Isn't this just a great reward for their aggression?
That's not our intention, and that is not what the contact group made up of
meaning the 5
U.S.
countries.
The Russia, the British, French, and Germans. That is not what we will accept, and it is simply not true that we will countenance a greater Serbia, and we are getting some measure of cooperation out of the government of Serbia in recent weeks to seal its border, the border that has been opened between Serbia and those portions of Bosnia which are populated by the Bosnian Serbs. It's a tough issue. These are hard choices. It will take more time, but I think we should stick with the diplomatic track.
But you say that we will not tolerate a greater Serbia, but there's been a great deal over the last almost 3 years that we have said we will not tolerate, and we have tolerated it over and over again.
I'm not sure that's true. I think that there has been progress. There are millions of people on the ground, displaced refugees, for example, and others who have stayed in their home areas, who are being fed and clothed and provided fuel by the international community. I certainly agree with some of the comments made earlier that the United Nations forces on the ground have not brought peace to Bosnia, far from it. But I think that their presence has made the war less murderous than would otherwise have been the case.
I'm wondering if people who are refugees on the ground would consider that progress towards peace, the fact that they are refugees, but they're not as far-flung refugees as they might have been otherwise.
I think we have to hold out the hope for them that someday many of them will be able to return. Some of them will have to go to new areas if there is a division of the country, not into separate states, but into different regions. People may not be able to go back to where they came from, but I think they do have a chance to go back to a secure place to reside and to pick up their lives.
When you talk about this diplomatic solution, do you dismiss out of hand what Senator Dole just said, get the UN peacekeepers out of there and then engage in robust airstrikes?
Not at all. I don't know whether the troop contributors who have provided the forces on the ground in Bosnia are going to want to stay indefinitely. But I do think that they serve a purpose. They serve an important purpose because the lives of the men and women and children in Bosnia are better because of the presence of these United Nations forces.
You heard in the story by Jim Laurie, a political analyst in England, saying that there is now open disdain for the United States on the streets of London. At some point, doesn't our national interest get caught up in this just because we say we're going to do something and then we don't follow through, or we seem to be paper tigers? At what point do we hurt ourselves mightily by not getting engaged?
I'm not sure what's going on in the streets of London, but I can tell you that with the British government, the French government, all of the countries which have been deeply involved, as we have, in looking for a solution to this hellish problem, we are approaching these issues very seriously. We do have tactical differences. The United States believes that there should be a more robust response on NATO's part than some of the countries who are worried about their men and women on the ground. But these tactical differences over timing, over the scope of operations, while important to a limited extent, should not overshadow our collective determination to try to find a peaceful solution to this war.
Mr. Tarnoff, but you take those tactical differences that you point out, and then you take the absence of a Soviet Union to overrun Europe, and very quickly, can you tell me why we need a NATO if it can't agree?
For reasons over and above Bosnia, Cokie, NATO is still important to Bosnia because we have and will continue to have a role to play. But the NATO of the future is evolving in ways that are important to European security writ large. Secretary Christopher, Secretary Perry, President Clinton will be traveling to Europe in the coming week or so, and they are going to be talking about a NATO which is reaching out to the east, which is trying to prevent in very important ways repetition of what has happened in the former Yugoslavia.
Thank you very much, Peter Tarnoff. I'll be back in a moment. Tomorrow, World News Tonight continues its week in Washington with a look at the House of Representatives, according to Newt Gingrich. That's World News Tonight, tomorrow on this ABC station. And that's our report for tonight. I'm Cokie Roberts in Washington. For all of us here at ABC News, good night.
If you wish a printed transcript of Nightline, please call 1-800-ALL-NEWS. If you wish a videocassette version of Nightline, the cost is $14.98, plus $3.95 for shipping and handling. Please call 1-800-ABC-9420.
Nightline is a presentation of ABC News. More Americans get their news from ABC News than from any other source. Tuesday.